Thank you. And so with that, I want to extend a really warm welcome to our panelists and our project partners and our guests. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Liz Blakeway. I'm the Network Director for Land to Table. And we're a nonprofit organization operating as a regional food system network based in the North Okanagan. So we're working with folks from farmers to local government to institutions and all aspects of the food system in between. And we're working to, build a network across the food system, but also undertake projects that work to strengthen our local food system. And that includes, growing the local food economy, increasing access to local food, and exploring opportunities to create a more resilient food system. This is our third and final Learning Circle session, which is kind of bittersweet. A lot of work has gone into these sessions, but it's really allowed us to engage with some great folks who we wouldn't otherwise connect with and have some really awesome conversations that are helping our thinking, learning questions that we can take into the UBCO local food procurement pilot project that we've been working on for the last year, and that will be scaling up into this next year as well. So based on what we've learned so far through the previous two sessions, the conversation topic today is around systems perspectives. So we've come to ask, if we're using institutional procurement as a means or as a way to create better local food systems, more localized, more resilient food systems, then how do we make this model, which includes procurement from small to medium scale farmers with these big important values attached to them, how do we make this model sustainable in the long term? And how do we allow it to be replicable across other institutions? And what are some of those systems issues that we need to consider as we work to scale this up? Okay, so that's kind of the focus of today. We've got some, I would say, I think Renoir and Mary, we were talking after yesterday and as we were planning for today's session, and we feel like we have some really heavy hitters in terms of our panelists today. We're really excited to have you all. So we've got 5 folks who are going to share. One of our key project partners who will provide some context of the work we've been doing, and then 4 panelists. So we'll begin with some introductions. Actually, pardon me. We'll begin with a bit of a summary. And sorry, Renoir, I messed that bit up. We'll begin with a bit of a summary that Mary's going to provide us of our previous 2 sessions, like just pulling in some of the key points that we're learning that have helped inform our questions. And then after Mary shared some of those summary points, then we'll hear from David, and David, you'll have to correct me if I get this wrong, who's the Culinary Director of UBC. Is that I think that you have more things. Yeah, okay. And David's going to share a little bit about the work that UBC has done to pave the way for local food procurement at both UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan. And then from there, we'll move into some introductions of our panelists, and then we'll go into a Q&A session with our panelists. I want to make sure that folks know if at any point you have a question that's popping up for you, place that in the chat and we'll be sure to capture it. I think we'll flow through this session similar to how we did the last one, where we'll have our panelists answer the questions, all 4 of them, and then we'll open that up for a question from our participants, from you, to see what's bubbling up. And Renoir, if you want to spotlight Mary actually to start. So Mary is a close project partner. Actually, Mary, why don't I let you introduce yourself? Sure. I won't I won't put words in your mouth. Yeah, go for it. Sure. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I've been working quite closely with Liz and Renoir in this. I was one of the founders, and I'm on the steering committee of Land to Table, but I'm also a professor at UBCO teaching about the food system. So I've been a bit of a bridge in this local food procurement project, because connecting the institution of UBCO with Land to Table for this project. And so Liz asked me to do a bit of a summary of where we're at so far. And I think we're still really processing this information. So I'm not sure I've got a really clear set of notes here, but I'll do my best. So far we've had 2 learning circles. And the first one was from the perspective of the institution, university or college. And the second one was from the perspective of the aggregators and distributors of local food. And now we're at the third one, which is the system-wide perspective, just trying to take a sort of step back and look at the whole system. So in the first learning circle, the institutional perspective, there were actually a few perspectives that were presented. We learned from the student perspective, and in particular, a representative from the Real Food Challenge, which is a USA-wide student collective. And they were mentioning, or she was mentioning, that students are really key often in pushing institutions to commit to, wider values in their food procurement. And the Real Food Challenge, what they did is develop a set of real food, quote, real food values around buying food that supports the local economy, it supports social justice, sustainability, and animal welfare. That were their 4 pillars of real food. And they developed a real food calculator tool that's used by students to audit food purchasing on campus. We also learned from the government perspective during the first learning circle, and that in the form of Feed BC. They have a program now that wants to increase BC grown and processed food that is purchased in government institutions, like universities and colleges, and as well as others. And their aim is food system transformation through this integration of government institutions. And they're providing a range of resources and supports. We also heard from the institution itself, several speakers, one from UBCO and one from University of Guelph. Some of the things we learned from them is that it's made a major difference that the university has taken over the management of food services by terminating the contract with the provider, Aramark. Because of this, they were able to develop and kind of follow a core set of principles, like the UBC vision and values that corresponds to many of the real food values mentioned earlier from the students, but goes beyond that. Some of what they've learned, I think, is that it's been important to start small, like our pilot project has been a good idea, and that it's important to build relationships along the local food value chain. That's been key, and that the model requires dedication, flexibility, and adaptability on the part of the staff. So moving on to the second learning circle, we heard from a variety of aggregators and distributors of local food. They were of a variety of scales, and they were both for-profit and not-for-profit. Some worked with certified food like organic, but some didn't. And their markets included institutions, but also groceries, restaurants, and even the good food box for low-income families. We heard about a variety of issues from them related to values, costs, and their struggles to make a successful business model of supplying local food to institutions and other markets, given that they're always competing against the cheap and convenient food of the global food system. So what have we learned overall? I don't know if I've managed to summarize all of it, but what I've kind of focused in on was a few things. The definition of local. So in the case of institutional local food procurement, food can still be a variety of things. We can have food that is real food, going back to that student presentation, which refers to a set of student-driven values around, sustainability and justice and so on. Food can be local. One definition of that would be like all of BC, and it might include being grown in BC, but it might just be only processed in BC. So there's a whole set of issues around that. And food can be, I think the word we've learned from the learning circles, it can be hyper-local. And this involves direct relationships with the institution, between the institution and the farmers. And it can even be hyper-local in that it's produced from a campus farm or garden. So a key question for our project is that we at Land to Table, and we really in the wider society here in the Okanagan, we're interested in supporting real and hyper-local food because we're in a place where in BC, in the Okanagan, in the North Okanagan, where farms are small and medium scale predominantly, and there's quite a lot of organic farms. So we want to keep those farms going. And we see this institutional local food procurement as a potential solution. But we don't want to pass on this higher cost of growing real and hyper-local food to the students at the institution because they're increasingly food insecure. UBCO wants unionized work for their food services employees too. And of course, we want reasonable livelihoods for farmers and a fair wage for farm workers. So this is complex. So, and what gives? And what can the government do? And what can the university at the level of the decision makers do to support this actually working? So I think our main question was, how do we make institutions as a market a sustainable one without passing the cost on to the students and the staff and the farmers and the farm workers? And I think probably one of the answers is that we're going to have to, the aggregator that we're using, Swak Organic, will have to be selling to values-aligned institutions that are willing to pay more for values. And one of our questions is, how do we create and maintain values-aligned institutions? So one of the things we've learned about is the role, how roles change. Students are really important for stepping up and doing things like auditing and for taking part in education and awareness raising events. Food services staff are also really important and need training for flexibility, to be responsive to seasonal foods and for doing the extra work like processing produce and fruit in season. The farmers need to be willing to tell their story to students and advocate for local food and advocate for the values of their farm. And there's a lot of challenges for the middle people, whether they're the processors or the aggregators and distributors, about challenges in staying afloat and competing against that cheaper food system. There's also a role for catalyzing and initiating, and then for convening and facilitating. And that's where you see people like Liz and nonprofits like Land to Table. But how do these nonprofits get the funding so that they can support projects like this? So, we just noticed there's a lot of effort. There's extra effort for students, extra effort for chefs, extra effort for aggregators and distributors, and a lot of effort going into relationship building and education and awareness raising. These roles, this extra effort are so important, but who funds them? So I think I'll stop there as a bit of a summary.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. I think that would really captures a lot of what we're taking away and a lot of what we're still grappling with and thinking about. And I think the panelists that we have today are going to make us actually think even harder about some of these things. We had a conversation yesterday with the panelists, and there continues to be some big questions, and there's a major balancing act that I think we're working to create here with these local food procurement pilot projects and scaling up that work. But David, I'd love if you could so folks may recall in our previous sessions, we've had one of our main project partners just share a little context about our work. Not to talk too much about what we've accomplished, but just to provide context for where these conversations are coming from. So we asked David if he would share a little bit today about the work that UBC has done to kind of pave the way for local food procurement, certainly in Vancouver, but more recently at the UBCO campus. So thank you, David.
Sure.
Take it away.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good morning, everyone. As Liz mentioned, my name is David Speight. I'm the Executive Chef and Culinary Director for UBC Food Services, and in my role, I have the opportunity to oversee the culinary program, both in Vancouver as well as Kelowna. I've been with the university for about 8 years now, and UBC has forever been a really a solid purchaser of local products and committed to that. But that changed in 2017, and we quite frankly took it to a whole new level. And how we did that was we created our food visions and values document, which is a very key document. It's public facing, it's on our website. We share it out as much as often. We want our students to challenge us on it. And we also hope that it is a inspiration for other universities across North America to follow our lead on some key food system initiatives that fall within there. And within our food visions and values, one of the biggest commitments is our commitment to local food. And not just buying local food, but also looking for new ways to expand how we buy local food and how we can develop new initiatives around local food. So at last count, pre-pandemic, UBC Vancouver purchased 62% of its nearly $12 million worth of food locally, which was a really great number. And we're currently tabulating our numbers for our most recent year to see where we are as we are slowly coming out of the pandemic, and hopefully that our percentage hasn't dropped. So that's our commitment in Vancouver. And then in 2019, we made the switch from a third-party operated food service provider in Kelowna on our UBCO campus, and we took that business in-house as well. And that way we could expand upon our food visions and values and take those philosophies to our Kelowna campus. And that happened in 2019. So it's still fairly new for us. And as we all know, our first full season, we never even got to complete it. In March, the pandemic hit and our world's changed. So we really haven't seen a full year of service in that operation yet. But we've been expanding our local knowledge and journey in that region as well. And one of the key ways we've done that is this project with Land to Table and UBCO on local food procurement. And it's been a wonderful year of learning. And essentially the project, we received some funding from the university as well as the Feed BC Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Fisheries. And the project is yes, to expand local food that UBCO buys, but it's much more than that. We've got a strong connection to the farmers that we're partnering with, and we really want to find a sustainable solution that works well for the farmers as well as for the institution. So bringing them into the conversation right at the start has been instrumental to the success. And one of the things we've done with this project is we pre-agreed on purchasing targets of certain products so that the farmers then knew that they had a customer for food that they were going to grow. And that is a really wonderful thing if you're a farmer, to understand that you can have a source for selling the food that you make before you even grow it. So that's really good. It's also great for the institution because we know what quality and how much of this great local food we're going to get from the farms. So it's essentially a large-scale CSA program that we embarked upon. And while our targets weren't perfect, they were pretty darn close. And both the farmers as well as the institution was very pleased with our success rate in our first year. And beyond the purchasing of the food, we also want to find new ways to aggregate a bunch of different products from local farms. The gold standard I always refer to is Vancouver Farmers Market Direct in Vancouver, which unfortunately is no longer, but it really was a great tool for chefs to be able to order from many different farms on one invoice, one order, one truck, one bill to pay. And that's really the gold standard that we're hoping we can learn how to recreate in the Okanagan region and then scale that up, bring on other institutions so those farmers have other sources for selling their fruits and vegetables, and the project can become more sustainable over the long term based on the economies of scale. So those are a couple of the key takeaways that we're trying to solve for with this project. We've learned a lot. There's still a lot more to learn about, but we're really excited to embark on phase 2 of this project and see where that can take us. So that's the journey we've been on in Kelowna, and I'm really excited to hear from you all today about your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. That was a really good synopsis. I love the thing I love about this is that I always pick up new and different pieces and perspectives, despite the fact that we've been meeting and working together for the last year. So yeah, that's really helpful from a kind of project coordination perspective. I'm really excited to introduce our 4 panelists today. These 4 women represent different and really important perspectives in terms of some of these systems challenges that we know that we're up against. So we've got Brittany Maguire from Meal Exchange, which is a national program. Lindsay Harris, who's our neighbor, the Kamloops Food Policy Council, but is also connected to UBCO. And we've got Annelise Grube-Cavers, who's a KPU, Kwantlen Polytechnic University Research Associate, but she's also one of our local farmers in the North Okanagan. And Kristina Bouris, who's with Feed BC and the Value Chain Innovation Team. Ooh, Renoir, I liked how you just dropped everyone in there as I was introducing them. That's good. So to begin, it would be so great to have you each just introduce yourselves a little bit about who you are, the work that you're doing, or your position, and maybe some of the role that you play or have played around understanding or creating systems change in food systems. Brittany, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. I'm excited to be here today in this conversation to talk with you all, but I'm already learning a lot, so glad to be here. I'm the program manager for Meal Exchange, and for those who don't know, we're a national charity for almost 30 years and have been the only organization really advocating for post-secondary student food security across Canada. Our vision is to create resilient post-secondary communities nationwide where students have access to good food that upholds their well-being and their values. We act as a catalyst for change by empowering students, facilitating campus collaboration among students as well as other stakeholders, and advocating for good food. We have a variety of programs which have changed over the years, but they're aimed at uplifting the voice of students and especially those impacted by food insecurity to create change through leadership, learning opportunities. A key thing that we take to these conversations is that every campus brings along its own set of unique, complex issues and demographics of students and potential solutions to address food insecurity. And so we think it's important to work with students and campuses directly to advocate for change and create change that reflects their particular needs. When I first started with Meal Exchange, I was leading the Good Food Challenge, which was modeled after the Real Food Challenge in the United States. It's already been talked about earlier in this conversation, which is focused on shifting procurement on campuses from to good food, which is socially just, ecologically sound, humane, and community-based. During the pandemic, student food insecurity has really been exacerbated, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. And Meal Exchange has focused more specifically on food security. So I think that will come through in the things that I talk about, that we are more focused on that now, but I just wanted to give that background that I also come with that lens a little bit. Prior to working with Meal Exchange, I also worked with the Atlantic Canadian Organic Regional Network for a couple of years, focused on educational programs and events for farmers, which also included programming, engaging farmers about climate adaptation and resilience. And before that, I worked for the Office of Sustainability at Dalhousie University, focused on various projects to make campus operations more sustainable, but specifically around food, on sustainable seafood and fair trade products. I also have an environmental background and a master's in environmental studies. So I think that given these various lenses and roles that I've filled, I think I approach this conversation with some understanding of producers, some understanding of campus administration and food services, obviously the nonprofit experience and perspective, and of course, students facing food insecurity, as well as some of the environmental and social justice impacts of food procurement. So that's, I would say, how I'm coming into this conversation.
That's it. Hey, just a few things.
Yeah. Just a few things.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Lindsay, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks for the invitation to join today. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation. My current role is as the Food Policy Implementation Lead for the Kamloops Food Policy Council, and I've been working with the KFPC in various capacities since 2016. When I started doing ethnographic research for my PhD, which I completed last year at UBC Okanagan. So have some ties to the UBCO campus through that role, and started as a community-based researcher with the Kamloops Food Policy Council. When my research study wrapped up a couple of years ago, I transitioned into working for the organization. And the primary role that I play right now for the Food Policy Council is implementing our Kamloops Food Hub project. So KFPC is one of the members of the BC Food Hub network. So we have received funding from the BC Ministry of Agriculture to build a food processing center. So we have a really wonderful kitchen that we're hoping will be open within the next few weeks to support food processing. Our facility is primarily going to focus on canning and dehydrated products. So we're really looking at shelf-stable products that are going to extend the season for local produce. But I'll say the Food Policy Council is it's actually Canada's oldest grassroots food policy council. It was founded in 1995, and at the time, the Toronto Food Policy Council was started the same year, 1995. But in Toronto was started as an arm of the municipal government, and the KFPC is fully independent and has been for all of its history. And the KFPC really has quite a diverse approach to food security and to thinking about food systems. So the Food Hub project feels like a manifestation, I guess, of many years of community effort towards supporting the regional food economy. But the Food Policy Council also has done extensive work with supporting community and household food security. And we run a couple of other programs right now, a gleaning program and a small urban farm, which is run as a food commons. I think that in terms of doing like regional policy advocacy, community food security work, plus attention to supporting the regional food economy, there are some really diverse approaches that we're taking that we could really consider ourselves as a partnership-based organization with a really sort of deep and rich network of people who come to food for different motivations and different passions, but with a very collaborative mindset. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think the Kamloops Food Policy Council is one of those examples that Land to Table has looked at as we have started to develop into our own organization. But also, Lindsay, remind me that things take time. Like you said, this hub is a culmination of a lot of years of work and imagining and partnerships. So it's a good reminder. Annelise, how about you? Thank you.
Hi. My name is Annelise, and with my partner Steve, we run Fresh Valley Farms in Armstrong in unceded Secwepemc territory. We raise certified organic beef, pork, chicken, turkey, and all on pasture also. So in addition to farming, I sometimes work for the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems at Kwantlen Polytechnic University as a research associate. And so several years ago, I think the reason I was invited to this conversation is because several years ago, we did an institutional food procurement project focused specifically on the Okanagan. And when I embarked on that research project, like I was the lead on that project, and I really looked at it like, this is a project to get more local food into local institutions. And what the project really kind of turned into was a study of why it wasn't already happening and what the barriers, which were really significant, were to making it happen. It wasn't just looking at educational institutions. I would say it was a little bit more heavily weighted towards health institutions. So prior to that, I did do a little bit of research in university on the Kamloops Regional Farmers Market, and have always been really heavily tied to local food systems and food production through family farming and farming myself. And now my partner and I are both more Steve than I, but we're both really quite active with the Small Scale Meat Producers Association. And they've just released a report actually yesterday which is a phenomenal report that everyone should have a look at. But one of the things that they're working on is an idea of similar to a food hub, getting like a butcher hub or meat processing hubs. So, which would be an opportunity for kind of collective meat processing, but also potentially for aggregation. So those are kind of the main things I would say that I'm involved in currently.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds exciting. I also wanted to add, in March 2020, Land to Table hosted a conversation around aggregation and distribution and opportunities for our region in that regard. And Annelise was at that meeting, and we were talking about supplying to institutions and what that would take. And one of the things that you said was, well, we need an institutional champion. If there isn't one, let's make one. Like, let's find one. Let's ask someone to step up to the plate. And that, for me, that was kind of the catalyst for what has turned into this pilot project and conversations about aggregation, and in part let us here. So I think that's like a fun fact. Kristina, how about you go ahead? Thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. Just making sure I'm off mute. Good morning, everybody. I am joining you from Victoria this morning on the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people. And great to see familiar faces and new faces across the province on this call. I work as the Senior Manager of Value Chain Innovation for the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. And for the last 4 years, I have been working on Feed BC, which, as you will have heard in your first webinar, is a government priority initiative to bring more BC foods to BC public sector institutions. And over the last 4 years, my role in Feed BC has evolved from being a team of 1 to a team of 3 to now a team of 7 people with tentacles across our ministry and across the province in public sector institutions and the supply chain. And as I'll talk about a bit in the answers to the questions, Feed BC really started with taking time to build a deep understanding of the barriers and the opportunities for institutional procurement of local food, building on Annelise's work and her team through KPU, then shifting to priming the system for change, and now as we come up to year 4, having initiated over 50 different projects or initiatives to move towards that transformation of the food system that works with partners across the supply chain on both opportunities now in our current food system and supply chains, as well as trying to envision a future and an alternative of what that could look like. And we're trying to advance both in different ways. Feed BC's work to date began in healthcare, building on a lot of work that was done even before Feed BC came along by our health authorities, who are champions. And then working with post-secondary most recently, 20 of our 25 post-secondary institutions in BC are now Feed BC partners, and we're starting to do work with other institutions in BC, as there are a number of different institutions, programs, and services that use provincial government funds to purchase food in different ways. As Feed BC has grown, we really felt the need to fill a particular set of gaps that I'll speak to later. But that is really about trying to help navigate and activate business opportunities for our producers and processors in the institutional procurement space. It's a complex supply chain. There are many complicated pathways that are led and governed by large national or international companies, and trying to create alternatives in that space needs some extra horsepower behind it. And so the Value Chain Innovation Service came to be to help activate those business opportunities. I just wanted to provide a little bit of my background just to frame comments today. I've been with the provincial government for 4 years. I specifically came because I was really excited about Feed BC, but before that I worked as an urban planner for 14 years for the cities of Vancouver and Victoria, and my passion is really local government food policy. How do we create local food systems that are just and sustainable at the local level, and also entrenched and supported with policy practices, staff who get it and understand it. And so I was grateful for opportunities in Vancouver and Victoria to do things like building on Lindsay's current position, look to Kamloops Food Policy Council and help set up Vancouver's Food Policy Council. Food is a chapter in Victoria's official community plan, which was the first municipality to do that. It's also the first municipality in Canada to have urban agriculture bylaws that actually support the commercial production of food within the city. And unfortunately, there's not always a lot of opportunities to work on food full-time in local government. So the province was a really great place to come, and just to be surrounded by colleagues who are so passionate around food, with all kinds of really exciting work happening at the ministry right now. My first job, though, as I was working on my master's in urban planning, was at UBC Farm. I handpicked greens and delivered them to Sage Bistro, and worked with UBC Food Services on setting up their tracking system for local food on campus. And so it felt like a delightful full circle, and it's so great to have David and others on the call right now to complete that. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a lovely kind of origin story, maybe, like full circle, like you said. Yeah, so like I said, heavy hitters with us today who are really have worked in so many areas of this and are thinking so much about this and living this. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to dive into our first question, because I know that time's going to fly by. And so that first question is, what are the major systemic barriers that affect the viability of institutional local food procurement? And our spin is, affect the viability from small scale producers specifically is kind of the lens that Land to Table has, because that's a group of farmers that we'd like to think that we represent and are helping to support. I guess the purpose of this question is to help us kind of map out or clarify what these issues are. And of course, you each bring a very different lens and perspective to this. So it's kind of helping us, again, build that picture. So the systemic barriers that affect the viability of institutional procurement is this, kind of giant question. Brittany, I think we'll go in the same order for this question, but I won't do that for the rest. Just because I think starting with students, that student perspective makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think it does make sense to start with students, because ultimately, if we're talking about campus food procurement, we're talking about food that students are going to eat. So it makes sense to center them in these conversations, and often they get left out of them. So I'm glad to be able to represent that. Yeah, so that's primarily the lens that I'm going to bring to this answer, but obviously I played other roles and worn other hats. But I wanted to focus on the student perspective for my role now. So I think that one thing that we really need to think about is the fact that student food insecurity is on the rise. During the pandemic that we've all been experiencing, students have been hit particularly hard, I think. So they have faced a loss of jobs in the service industry. A lot of jobs that are cut first are service jobs and people who are new to organizations. So that's obviously youth and students. They faced lack of government support while a lot of other folks were getting served. There wasn't, at least at first, any other support system available for students. There has been increasing tuition, especially international student tuition. And I know that looks different across campuses, but in some cases there have been increasing tuitions. And of course, cost of living, rent is like all-time high across the country right now. And then at times there has also been closure of food services. Some students have been kicked out of residence, and then also closure of these campus food banks and all of these other services that normally exist during the year to help students because people were not allowed onto campus. And so even students supporting each other with student-led food initiatives were no longer able to access even space to make those things happen. So I think the result of this is that we thought that probably food insecurity is getting worse among the student population for all of these and probably other reasons. And so, yeah, we had a sense of that and decided that we wanted to do a survey across the country to see what was going on. So this fall, we surveyed over 6,000 students at 13 campuses across the country. Before the pandemic, the last study that we had done was of 5 institutions in 2016, and the rate of food insecurity among students was about 40%. This time, it was 56.8% of the students that we surveyed. Of course, that is not necessarily to say that is actually the rate across all of the students in the country. That is the students that we surveyed. But of the same methods used, which is convenient sampling and getting it out through social media, through our networks, et cetera, that's the rate that we got. And so 20.7% of those students were severely food insecure, and we used the Canadian Household Food Secure module to calculate that, and 36.1% moderately. Yeah, so that's significant and has been an increase during the pandemic that we're seeing. And we have been hearing that anecdotally as well. Students are also facing challenges accessing healthy foods and maintaining healthy eating habits. In the survey, 60% of the students that responded stated that they could not afford to eat balanced or nutritious meals this fall. And when we asked students what would be helpful to improve their food access, they gave a lot of different answers, but one of them was more affordable food and meals on campus, which came in at about 20% of students. Of course, less students were probably on campus this fall than other semesters, so that might be a higher percentage in future years, right? When more students are actually on campus and not studying remotely. Yeah, sorry, was there a comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I didn't realize I wasn't on mute.
That's sorry. Okay. No, it's okay. Yeah, so just to name that, I think that there is a real challenge in making food on campus healthy, culturally diverse, because that's also something that we're seeing in conversations with students, that there isn't necessarily the diversity of culturally appropriate food. And that changes based on demographics, right? The demographics at George Brown College are different than Dalhousie, than UBC, but they're not always able to find culturally appropriate food on their campuses. So meeting this demand for healthy food, culturally diverse food, local, fair, just food, also without increasing the cost, and actually probably trying to make it more affordable if we actually want to address food insecurity, is like a really big challenge that I think we need to keep centered in the conversation. Campus food is already quite expensive, and students are captive in some ways to that. So, in comparison to what I would spend on average for food in a month, students are actually paying more, but they have less income, they're paying tuition, and they don't really have a lot of other options. So, if you live in residence, you're often required to purchase a meal plan, and many campuses are far from other food options. You might be on campus for really long hours, weird hours, late at night. And a lot of campuses don't have access to food storage or cooking facilities. So you really can't bring food for a 12, 14-hour day or whatever it might be on campus. So I think for all of these reasons, it becomes really challenging for students to navigate that situation. And obviously they're already stressed and under a lot of pressure to balance their courses, work, and really low income. I would also say that students are really interested in food and engaging in these conversations, but there's a lot of barriers to student involvement. So I think putting the weight on them to solve this problem, which I see as sometimes the rhetoric can be a lot of pressure. And I do think that they're really interested and worried actually about the environmental and social justice issues of our time that are predominantly going to hit them in the future if we're thinking about climate change. And I think they are interested in sustainable, local, and just food, and they want their institutions to take leadership on climate action and other issues, but they're first and foremost primarily faced with high costs of education, living, food, and face immediate food security issues when making their daily choices around food. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of pressure. I also think that students are new and transient, and even if they are asking for better in their food, they often get ignored, eventually leave, and it's hard to maintain this student activism over time. And it also takes them a while to make sense of the campus food environment, make sense of leadership. And so by the time they are ready and confident and feel like they have the right to ask any questions, they're almost out the door. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes campus administrators and food services know this. And I have heard, and I'm not saying that everybody is like this, but I have heard discussion of just waiting until the particular students leave that are activists, and then the complaint will go away. And so anyways, I just think that there are opportunities to find solutions to address these issues and creative ways, but in some cases, I think that there's a lack of willingness to listen to or work with students, and there are some real barriers. They're transient, they're nervous, they're young, and they're only here for a short amount of time. But I think if we miss that opportunity, we might create solutions that are actually not effective at meeting their needs. There's also lots of other challenges, as we all know, and I'm sure all the other panelists are going to talk about it more, but the volume of food to provide. And I've heard that there's not enough consistent local food, especially in other areas of the country, because we're coming from a national perspective, where there's not enough food available in the region to meet local demand. I'm thinking about coming from the Maritimes, for example. And in particular, the academic year overlaps with mostly winter in some places in Canada, right? And so there's a limited availability and, logistical and capacity challenges of multiple vendors, space for storage, fridge space, and all of that complication rather than like streamlined large distributor relationships. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from the other panelists, but just wanted to say that I'm also aware of those barriers too.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's what I have to say about that.
That's a lot, right? There's a lot of layers to that, but I haven't worked directly with a lot of students, so it's good to have that big picture perspective and understanding of the layers. Lindsay, you bring more of a policy lens to this question, but I know that you also work closely with producers and that side of things as well. So what are your thoughts in terms of these major systemic barriers that affect the viability of local food procurement from small to medium scale farmers, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I have so many thoughts. And I sort of really like the way that Brittany kind of ended by touching on some of those. I guess I'd call them like the supportive infrastructure pieces that really affect the ability to have local food available at the correct scale for institutional purchasing. And so with being sort of like very midstream of working very hard to implement our food hub project and have it, it's not quite open yet, and we kind of don't really know yet the impact that that's going to have. But just some sort of like context to that project, the Food Policy Council started convening a collective impact process back in 2018, and was a community-wide cross-sector collaborative process to generate ideas for shared project implementation. And the Food Hub is really the sort of biggest and most tangible project that's come out of that work. Sort of flowed very directly into the Ministry of Agriculture's priority to start these different food hubs. And I do absolutely think that the Food Hub network is a very critical piece to address the gap in supportive infrastructure. So in our region, when we were assessing the gaps and needs and the feasibility for the project, things like cold and dry storage, commercial kitchens for processing, those kind of existing material pieces of infrastructure were a huge gap in our community. And so I do think that the Food Hub Network is a great step towards that. But I also think that this investment is coming after decades of disinvestment in this kind of supportive infrastructure in the region. And so, so it sort of remains to be seen, like, is this actually going to be bringing enough support to allow for the kind of aggregation and scaling up that would be needed to support the institutional processing. There's another side to this supportive infrastructure piece that I want to touch on, which is the organizational capacity piece. And so the ability to, as an organization, have the capacity, the funding, the staff, the space, to do this really complex work of convening and collaborating And Liz or Mary, one of you touched on this, just in terms of land to table also experiences that, that challenge in your work. It's very much the same for us, where there's not, there's not like at the level of municipal governments or regional governments, there's not stable core funding that's available to support that work. And so that, that kind of organizational capacity is something that takes a really, really long time to grow in the absence of sort of direct and dedicated support that says, yes, collaboration is absolutely essential in order to make this happen, but collaboration is work, and that work is valuable, and that work needs to be invested in. So that's definitely a struggle, and I think is really where policy advocacy needs to go next in terms of work at local and regional governments. In Kamloops, for example, we're so grateful that we have at the municipal level an approved food and urban agriculture plan, but there's no tangible investment from the municipality in order to implement that plan. So, the plan is there, the supportive policies are there, but there's not the corresponding investment in capacity that needs to go hand in hand with the policy. So we're definitely thinking a lot about that as an organization. Then I want to shift gears a little bit and think about systemic barriers in maybe a more sort of conceptual way, and think about some of the, some of the mindsets or worldviews or cultural values that we have embedded in our food systems, and the way that at the Food Policy Council we're thinking about the importance of those mindset shifts as being really fundamental to making systems level changes. So I'm thinking about the way that we understand food as a commodity rather than as a gift, or the way that we think that that land is something that can be privately owned, or the way that we think of independence versus interdependence, or competition versus collaboration. All of those are cultural mindsets that we carry with us that really affect how we operate in our food systems, and so we're really trying as an organization to take very seriously what it looks like to dismantle some of those mindsets that come to us through colonialism, through capitalism, through white supremacy, and thinking about ways that those like systems of power, systems of oppression, systems of land dispossession are really impacting the way that the food system operates. And that if we're bringing solutions to the table that don't actually address the root causes of those power differentials, then ultimately those solutions will be insufficient to create systemic change. So I guess when I sort of think about how that operates at the level of like small and medium-sized farms, which and there's some really like important tension or paradox to kind of consider in this situation, because like often, as is the case in our region, those small and medium-sized farms, they're the farms that are doing the good work of producing real food, trying to farm in ecologically, important ways, and bring those values of justice and sustainability to the food that they're producing. But at the same time, there is the fact that the incentives for those small and medium-sized farms are really not they're really not supporting them to engage in kind of deeper levels of collaboration that would be needed to engage in like aggregation for institutional purchasing, because the incentives for those farms that are successful are towards, like sell to the high end of the market, in this sort of like, niche, sell high-priced organic food at the farmers market. That's where a lot of these farms have been able to find the most success and viability for themselves as independent businesses. And so in our work at the Food Policy Council, as we're thinking about our next steps with our Food Hub project of trying to leverage the existing facility that we have, this summer we'll be launching a feasibility study that will bring together producers and all kinds of cross-sector participants to try to develop a distribution and aggregation system that we can run out of the Food Hub. But as we're thinking about doing that, it's really, really hard to look at the ways that in the incentives for these small and medium farms are not towards collaboration. Or they're towards like a very kind of superficial level of collaboration, but not the kind of deeper level that would be needed to make something like this really viable. So those feel like really, really complex problems to me, and I'm hopeful that we'll kind of get to like some of the problem solving that can help to address them as we move forward in the conversation today.
Whoa, thank you. Those are big pieces. What I failed to mention at the beginning of this session is that these learning circles are funded through a Vancouver Foundation Systems Change grant. And these are the exact questions that we had hoped to be exploring as a part of that work. So thank you for surfacing those very big, very complex issues. And I think, Annelise, like I think your perspective might help kind of connect some of those pieces in terms of the infrastructure that Lindsay's talking about and the pressure on small scale farmers and the regulations and the requirements that small scale farmers have to uphold that maybe aren't fair, that are a part of these systems that make it difficult. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so like, as I mentioned when I sort of introduced myself for the past research project that I worked on, it really ended up focusing in on those regulatory barriers. And there are some that are a lot clearer than others. So, for example, the requirement of good agricultural practices or GAP certification for fruit and veggie farms. And then in terms of meat, there was sort of a blanket requirement for Canadian Food Inspection Agency inspection on meats that were going into a lot of institutions, as opposed to our provincial regulation, which is under the Ministry of Agriculture and can only be sold within the province of BC. And in some ways, I feel like the need for those regulatory layers in institutions, it's a lot of it is a question of kind of liability or food safety concerns, but they do really replace, in some ways, a level of transparency and a relationship between the food purchasers and the food producers, which, as was mentioned previously, having a lot of those relationships is really onerous. So that's kind of like a logistical and a cost thing on the end of the purchasers. But what I did find really interesting in terms of that work was that if there was a champion present in an institution or in an institutional system or structure, then a lot of those regulations could be negotiated in some way, or like that whole system didn't need to be adopted by every institution. And my favorite example of that is in the Yukon, in their hospital programs, they have a traditional food program, and they've just kind of reframed regulations to make it work to bring in hunted game and kind of other things that would really not be allowed in, for example, Interior Health Authority's kitchens at this stage, and likely in lots of kitchens. So I thought that was really interesting. It was sort of like where there's a need identified to really serve a community, and there's a champion who's willing to put that work in. then a case was able to be made, and the need for those regulations was reframed. So yeah, I think so. That's one side, the regulation. I think that's really the biggest barrier in a lot of ways, because it's embedded in the distribution system. If you're distributing through Gordon Food Services, through Cisco, you do need to have those regulations in place. So you can't even kind of enter that food chain without those things in place. But then there's also another part of it that's kind of the flexibility in terms of on both the sides of the producer and the purchaser. So like I gave an example yesterday in our conversation, if someone was to ask for, just all of only one thing, they just want all the briskets from a cow, then what do you do with the rest of the cow if you're selling direct to consumers also, or you have other markets? Like unless you have one stream that wants all, it's difficult to make that work. So there's just a requirement for flexibility. And that's both in terms of the capacity of kind of kitchen staff, sort of culinary flexibility in terms of menu, but also in terms of the institution's actual processing facility. So what their kitchen is like. Can they take, a primal of a pig and break it down? Can they take, a huge amount of potatoes or something to make that delivery less onerous, not like a small amount of produce for each delivery? So I'd say those are the main barriers. And then sort of like Lindsay mentioned, there is that other side of the producer, whether there's an incentive to get them into the program, but without that pathway, I guess, then it's really difficult to offer an incentive or have that conversation, even get that conversation started. So in brief, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think what you're also speaking to there, like I loved that example you shared about, a kitchen wants, a restaurant wants all your briskets. And you're like, wow. But our values are to provide variety to our customers, that our customers also have, like our individual customers have access to briskets. But I think that also speaks to cultural, our cultural mindsets around food. Like, we want the highest cuts, or, we want to serve certain things at certain times, and it doesn't work with the seasonality or with the scale.
Yeah, there just has to be a balance, I think, between those two needs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point for our institutions as well. Kristina, I'm going to pass over to you. And like you said, you've been with VBC for 4 years and probably really started with understanding what these barriers are and working your way up into developing solutions. But maybe, this question is about these systemic barriers. Like what do you guys know? What are you working with and against and for in that context?
Thank you. And, thank you, Brittany, Lindsay, and Annelise, for your introduction, because I think there's a number of them that have been highlighted, right? That need for champions, or the barrier being a lack of demand or awareness from institutions for local foods, supply. Is there the right product in the right volumes, the right specifications? The existing procurement arrangements do involve global companies, and the system really favors large national food and agriculture companies that can meet those specifications. I wanted to talk about two other challenges that we haven't brought up today. The first is price point. Institutions in particular are an extremely price sensitive market, and I would argue, in fact, one of the most difficult markets to get into. Healthcare in particular, very price sensitive. I know we have Curtis Langford on the call today from Interior Health. Health authorities, I'm not sure what the existing spending is right now, but just before the pandemic, it was between as low as $6.40 and all the way up to just over $10 per patient per day for food budget. And so working within that, post-secondary institutions do have more flexibility, and others on the call can speak to that, especially those with meal plans who do have a little bit more ability to budget and make some of those larger volume buys because they can project forward. But that price sensitivity is really important as we have this conversation about all the values that are important to maintain, because what I've found is, despite staff support and an understanding of the value and financial and community impact of local real food, the reality of a few cents more has big implications. You know, we've got an example of one health authority we worked with on trying to find a local producer, small business for muffins, and the difference of a few cents per muffins per day was too much to absorb because it really put it over. And so, and we're also in a situation with the pandemic that I think for all food services on the call, labor is incredibly difficult to attract right now. Convenience is becoming more important, those labor and cost savings measures. So it's not just in the cost of the food, but it's also, you know, if the products coming in require a bit more work, you know, some of those decisions that are being made. So that was the first challenge or barrier I wanted to address, because I feel like it's often the elephant in the room on these conversations, and it's complicated. It's very complicated and requires a lot of you know, government and institutional discussion and a big factor. You know, a big series of factors that are outside the control of individual producers and processors and their immediate supply chain. The other is about business readiness and this lack of coordination of the supply chain. And many BC producers and processors lack awareness of the government facilities food service market. Like, they may just not even be aware of it as an option. And this is hampered by some challenges that I think exist in most food supply chains, which is a lack of communication, coordination, and problem solving among the many different actors, right? You've got your different parts of the supply chain, and especially in a multinational global system, they kind of operate independently. And so smaller producers and processors also face the added challenge that they don't, as we talked about, don't have the scale and access to equipment, other infrastructure to be facilities ready to participate in these existing supply chains. And so as a result, I think many small producers and processors believe they can't participate, and they just choose not to. And so as a result, it reinforces that facilities can then rely on this abundance of non-BC food products or local food products that are sourced and distributed and purchased easily and fit into that existing models. And many of these are available in other provinces or internationally where that scale supports the access to other food products. And because those distribution channels and contracted food services favor these larger, well-established businesses, it's faster, it's more convenient. So facilities, I think, are interested, and they're also with this facing this dilemma of, this is convenient, it's set up, it's the way my contracts are set up, I know how to do this. So I think finding solutions to local food products that are grounded in all the values we've talked about on this call really requires a commitment to understanding and responding to the needs of the facilities market, collaboration and innovation to build those opportunities across the supply chain, and also really having a strong value proposition, right? Like, what in a very tangible way is an institution going to get that is different, right? And the other part where we often have seen, we did a big review in the first year of Feed BC, looking at aggregation initiatives and why there's a lot of really great examples. And David brought up Vancouver Farmers Market Direct. And the question was like, why do so many of them fail? Right? Like, these are great initiatives of cooperation, collaboration. And one of the key findings was that it's often on the business aspects. It's about having a sound business case, about governance, about scaling to the right size, about having those sound business fundamentals. I think that's great news, because that's actually fixable, right? That's something we can invest in and help support these initiatives. And I think the work that Land to Table is doing right now is such a great opportunity to really take learnings from other initiatives and learn from failure, right? And but also see how to advance this work, and also be targeting producers and processors early in their business planning so that they may not be ready to sell to the institutional market now, but let's get them while they're making some of those early business decisions now. Food safety certifications, you know, we've got two different approaches. We can either try to get more, recognize that's the way the system is now, try to get more food producers GAP certified, or we can try to work and get more flexibility in our food safety certifications. Maybe the meeting is halfway in the middle, but I think we need to get that information out as much as we can to producers and processors so they're aware of this market and they're making business decisions now that might leave doors open for them down the road.
Whoa, okay. I'm having this thought that we should have had this conversation first and like a year ago. Just like chicken and egg thing. This, I think, thank you all so much. That was so rich with information. And I think the next question, which I think, you know, we had talked about this a bit yesterday with our group about kind of combining question 2 and 3 or 3 and 4, as it were. And I think that would be a good, oh, pardon me. I'm going to pause. I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm watching the clock. I would love to invite our participants to chime in with any questions that you might have. There's a lot of information here. I'm wondering if there's anything bubbling up for you that you'd like to ask our panelists before I hurry us off into the next question. And I understand if you're still digesting and processing that as well. Okay, and also please feel free to just plop questions into the chat because we can pick those up. I can make sure I pick those up. Okay, so I think those are lots of layers that I think now we can take into maybe some of these problem-solving questions. So the assumption that we're kind of starting with this next question is if we're using institutional procurement as a means of creating a better local food system, so as a way to provide market access for our small to medium scale farmers, as a way to maybe create multiple decentralized systems and support for local food, then how do we ensure that this is a long-term solution? So the question that we are asking is, how do we make local food procurement sustainable for institutions in the long term that also supports hyperlocal and real food farms, as Mary kind of outlined it, while maintaining a commitment to students so that food is affordable, and also a commitment to say campus staff or unionized positions so that we have both student food security and a livable wage for staff, and we're supporting hyper local and real food. Like those are a lot of things within all the complexity that you have explained. What are some of the opportunities that we have to make this a long-term model? I'm going to paste that in the chat. And I would invite, I don't want to prescribe an order here. I would invite whoever is wanting to jump in first, please go ahead. It's like the race to unmute.
I'm happy to start if maybe as a general introduction. Thanks, Liz. So I believe there's 3 strategies to making local food procurement sustainable over the long term, so that that this interest is sustained and starts looking beyond just local food to a number of the other values included. And also I'm going to segue as well into our final question, which is how do we make sure this is entrenched?
Cool.
So I think the first is there has never been a better time for local food right now. the floods, the heat domes, so many supply chain challenges during the pandemic have really created an opportunity and a need and a recognition for the opportunity for local food. We have Fraser Health, for example, in the Lower Mainland, that Campbell's Soup hasn't been able to supply their soups to health authorities or to customers across North America reliably. And so this was the opportunity they needed to turn to Goodly Foods, which makes foods out of reclaimed vegetables that would other go to waste out of a food hub in the Lower Mainland, and it's now supplying Fraser Health institutions. And that is something that has come from the conditions have all been set for local food. And I think my advice would be to use local food as an entry point to start discussing those other values around living wages, food security, the animal welfare, the other values that expand that conversation beyond local, but to really be taking advantage of this awareness of local right now as that door is open. The second thing would be to really understand the system deeply in order to change it, to really deeply understand what motivates institutions, students, supply chain partners, food purchasers, food services to get involved and really work towards this local food procurement over the long term and stay committed to it. It has to work for every player in the system, no matter what system you're in. And, Annelise, you brought up the issue of champions, right? What do producers and processors need to make this work for them? What would make it better for distributors or contracted food services to participate in this? What does an alternative pathway look like the one that we're talking about today with land to tables aggregation initiatives? What would make institutions choose something other than the lowest point option, right? And there are a lot of reasons. When you talk to health authorities, for example, there's a lot of reasons they go with broadline distributors. It's easy. They want to go to one supplier. And how do you work within what you learn there to help try to create that alternative? Recognizing that broadline distributors are not a great financial deal for food and agriculture businesses, especially small and medium ones. I think the third part of it is, where we've seen sustainable change in the food policy world, and I'll include this, is it really takes a trifecta. So three things working together. First of all, you need the public institutions demanding local food, asking for it, right? And that is in formal ways, through RFPs, for example, contracts, but also informal ways where you have your sustainability policies, the type of values that David talked about that UBC has. The second part of that is that your decision makers who are making the food decisions are champions, and you have invested a lot in championing that, right? As Brittany pointed out, the students are a really important part of this conversation, but often transient and not there for a long time, right? And so when they're gone, it's your food buyers who are still there. It's your RFP writers, for example, and that they're aware of local foods, of the opportunities, and that there's a deep base that this is something that they're looking to. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if they chose local first? And the third part of that is really building that public, student, patient value for local food so that they see the value in it and they're supporting it. So within those three things, again, really using local food as an entry point, deeply understanding the system in order to change it, and then building that demand and network of champions. I think that's, pardon the food pun, but I think really the centerpiece of how to sustain this type of change over the long term. Thank you.
But perfect. Just three things. We'll just build that into our work plan for the next year. Done. And as Kristina mentioned, there was kind of a third question there that we had discussed before, which I popped into the chat as well, which is how do we ensure this procurement model is entrenched despite changes that happen in our institutions at our government level and program investment level. I just wanted to add that in. So you're welcome to tackle one or both.
So I'll jump in. I think like the price point conversation I know is a really, really significant one for a lot of institutions, for maybe all institutions. But I do think that, so I think that a really important part of framing that conversation is, especially when you're looking at the more highly public funded institutions. So again, that would be maybe more health, but education as well, would be just looking at the benefit kind of public money benefiting local economies, and really what that looks like. So even if the price point is that much lower, looking at kind of the multiplier effect of if you're purchasing local and you're purchasing for more, but that money is being circulated locally, what does that mean for a community? I think that aspect is undervalued. You know, economics just really gets simplified and looked at in the individual silos, and that would be, you know, above the institutional level. It would be at a kind of a government level, I think, and have to involve voices from throughout the value chain. And then going back again to creating champions and really supporting champions, supporting their growth. I know some restaurants, even in Kelowna or in the Okanagan, they'll take their kitchen staff to farms to have that really involved relationship, to get them really interested in how the food that they're cooking is being grown and what makes it kind of so special, so local to their terroir. And some of those, you know, they're higher class restaurants, but that idea of making those connections, building those connections and maintaining them, I think is really, really important. And then I think with any kind of new institutions, just like Kristina mentioned, with new farmers, looking at their business plan, I think with new institutions, looking at how you can create flexibility in terms of the facilities that they have, and just a broader range than maybe how things are currently designed. And I think that there's other ways too of looking at the economics. So again, because so much of this research that I did focused on health, like the amount of food waste in health institutions is huge sometimes. So if you look at that cost, all of the food that's purchased that is actually not even consumed and is thrown out because of, you know, maybe quality or flavor or cultural relevance or any of those, I think that is just, it's highly relevant to the economic discussion. And then in terms of the health of students, like I know that there's been lots of research done in the States on behavioral issues and, you know, putting like healthy options into vending machines and that kind of thing. So the benefits of that to students, to the overall health system, to society in general, I think that's, it can be made as an economic argument. And there's one really concrete example. Well, I'm sure that there's several, but in Canada, the Ontario Children's Hospital, CHEO, they did I don't think it's just a pilot project. I think that they've changed to a different menu kind of option. And anyways, CBC's White Coat Black Art did a story on it that was really fantastic. And I'll actually just copy this link into the chat, but it showed like improved health outcomes for children. And I believe that they talked about the economic argument there as well, because kids were asking for the food that they were getting. So then they were eating it all. They weren't, you know, wasting a large portion of it. So I think that there's different, while price point is really important and really significant, like, you know, $1 or whatever, a 50-cent per pound potato and a $2 per pound potato, it is hard to match that. But in some regards, I think that there are other, economic arguments that can be made. So anyways, building champions, and I think creating that framework, that conversation that's a little bit broader and talks more to the community benefits and not just that singular relationship between producer or distributor, kitchen and eater, but like there's a bigger community around those those characters, those stakeholders as well, creating capacity, and then maintaining flexibility. I think that is, like Kristina said, there's an interest in local. I think there's also like trends towards the seasonal, and then looking at other ways that maybe flexibility could be built in. Like I know probably already at Thompson Rivers University, they're working with the meat cutting, like, you know, and the culinary arts. So they're able to break down a whole animal and bring it across. Maybe there are opportunities like that at other institutions that are not being fully realized because it hasn't been a conversation. It hasn't been brought to everyone's attention, or there haven't been those specific champions. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. There's so much there that it affirms some of what we're hoping to do this year as well, in terms of creating local food champions on campus. Like starting
David
to build
put something interesting in the chat too that maybe he wants to mention.
Yeah, quantifiable local economic contribution credits might.
Well, I just think we all know that the full circle benefit is positive, and the challenge, you know, I'm kind of like Jeffrey. It's a unique situation where we have culinary students that we do teach these fundamentals to, keeping in mind that there's a huge spread on what a culinary student is. It's everyone from working, you know, in fast food to fine dining. So the challenge is, I've been a farmer and I understand getting $7 a pound for fingerlings at Granville is much more attractive than getting, you know, $2 at, you know, a restaurant's door. So there's all those pieces, but I think maybe if we look at it almost like carbon credits, is there a tax benefit we can get? If we can track and quantify how much we're putting back into the local economy, because I understand the plight of the farmer. And like you said, you know, everyone wants a brisket or a tenderloin. So, you know, without, you know, we have to slowly change everyone's, we don't have to change it. We have to take it back to where it was. It's almost like 50, 60 years ago now, where you couldn't buy chicken breasts on a styrofoam package. So, yeah, you know, you could buy a half chicken, you could buy a quarter chicken, you could go to a butcher shop.
Yeah.
So taking like the retail grocery model mentality out of it, like what you want, when you want, like as much as you want. But in the interim, you know, because that's going to take, you know, 7 generations or whatever of re-education. Is there a way that we could, as institutions, and, you know, many different types of institutions, recover some money as a tax break by really immersing ourselves in this? Because we will have a challenge too. Like I look at the 20,000 students we have on our 2 campuses, and I think UBC's just done it, VCC's done it, SFU's done it, is we have to charge a specific amount just to break even. We are subsidizing food, and it's still quite often a challenge for us to convince the public that this is the price of food. Although they can go to, you know, A&W and buy a meal, which would cost more than what they're paying here. There's just still this perception. Like I had someone come in and steal a bunch of ketchup and asked me, and I said, can you put that back? And they said, isn't it part of our tuition? So it's a tough crowd that we're dealing with. So if there was a government initiative that said, you know, UBC's at 68% or whatever, and, you know, they quantified that spend into how it contributed to the local economy, and they got a specific tax break. I think that would go a long way, because when we're talking about, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, you know, the 50-cent potatoes versus the $2 or $7 potatoes is a challenge. I think the farmers want what's best. I think that the institutions want what's best. It starts at convincing the public that this is what they need, but also what they can afford.
Yeah.
But anyways, that was a long explanation of my comment.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And I wonder if that speaks to some of what Lindsay and Brittany have shared, like in terms of incentives, and of course, affordability. Like, those are the big pieces. So happy to have either of you kind of jump in
Yeah, I think both of what David's saying as well as what Annelise have been saying have been speaking to things that were on my mind when I was thinking about this question. I think, first of all, if we talk about the culture of food and how it's valued on campuses or not valued, I think, from our perspective, even though food insecurity is really detrimental to mental and physical health, and this has been proven through research studies, and that access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food, is really necessary for academic success. The issue of student food insecurity is not really taken that seriously. And we invest a lot of money into education, actually, of youth and students. But if we're not feeding them properly, they're not actually going to be able to learn and have that opportunity that we expect that we're getting from the money that we're pouring into the education system in Canada. And so I think that speaks a little bit to what Annelise was saying about the economic value, maybe a little more holistically. What are the impacts if we don't invest in good food on campuses? Like, there are all these other ramifications that maybe aren't taken into account when we think about the cost of food. And actually, I think some see it as a rite of passage for students to experience food insecurity, to go hungry throughout their educational experience, rather than it being like a fundamental barrier to their learning and well-being. And I've actually had people make those comments. And so I think that speaks to like an underlying culture of not valuing food and not taking it seriously, what it is like to not be able to eat while you're trying to study and learn and just live your daily life and what that does on your well-being. And I think if we took this issue seriously, especially, government and campus administrators and everyone else involved, we would try to find innovative ways to make student food more accessible and affordable. And, I think a big issue here is involving the people who actually rely on the food. So students in these conversations and consulting them and including them in decision-making about food. In particular, we see that international students, BIPOC students, queer students, and students of low income or that are heavily reliant on loans to be able to go to school in the first place are really disproportionately impacted by food insecurity. And I think that they should be consulted in developing solutions, not only so that it actually fits their needs, but so that we're actually saving money and time and effort in developing these things. If they aren't, involved and consulted, you might come up with something that is like ultimately not going to be wanted to be eaten by the people that you're trying to target. So yeah, I think there are opportunities to meet some of this strong student desire that we've seen through our surveys for healthy, fresh, affordable food with purchasing from local producers. But these solutions, menus, ingredients are going to look different on different campuses, depending on student demographics and obviously the geographic constraints of local food systems and things like that. I think we also need to try to empathize and come to terms with the fact that the majority of students cannot afford to eat what they actually want to eat on a daily basis. Sometimes I hear that students don't buy the fresh or healthy options, even though they said that they wanted them. So that means that they clearly don't want them. But sometimes, I wonder if they were actually consulted on those options, if they are hearty or filling, are they culturally appropriate? Are they reasonably priced in comparison to the other options available? Are they even marketed to people? People get into habits of grabbing what's quick and convenient. And are they quick and convenient? You actually sit down between your classes and have that meal. So some of these constraints around, takeaway food and all these kinds of things create real barriers just in your life of going from class to class. And I think, students are ultimately in a situation where they are forced to try to get the most out of their limited funds. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about the people who are ultimately going to eat this food. I think we can also look at student leadership and partner with students. Here we've been talking about institutional food procurement, but there is also options to just partner for local producers to partner with student organizations that are also doing stuff to address student food insecurity. So for example, one of our student ambassadors at Guelph University just launched an affordable produce market at her university where the fruits and vegetables are sourced via The Seed, which is a not-for-profit community food project at the Guelph Community Health Center that buys produce at wholesale prices for its own community farmers markets throughout the city, but they're also giving it to at a discounted rate. And there's been some funds and stuff that have been gone to support this project. And at the Loaded Ladle, which has existed for 12 years now, I think, at Dalhousie University, they provide accessible, sustainable, locally sourced food to students 4 times a week. And it's either free or pay what you can. I think it used to be pay when you can when I was a student. I think it might be free now. Part of their funding comes from a student levy, where every student pays a few dollars per year on top of their student union fees. And then that goes into creating this service for students, which is a lot more like a dignified and accessible way to access food support rather than a food bank, which can be incredibly stigma. There's a lot of stigma associated with that. And so anyways, I think that there are those and many other really cool student food initiatives across the country, and some that have been around for over a decade and are constantly expanding. And I know that they're already getting produce from local producers. So although obviously the volume is not the same as what we're talking about in some of these other conversations, I do think that there's an opportunity for those solutions that are a bit, or markets that are a little bit outside and might actually have less constraints than some of these other constraints that we're talking about in some ways. And we see it there's strong-ish interest in those kinds of things across the country. And I think there's also an opportunity for the government and foundations, et cetera, to fund these kinds of projects, to help make them sustainable over time, and help institutionalize them as part of the campus. Mm-hmm. I think this Loaded Ladle is able to exist because they had a very difficult struggle with food services, but over time, they came to terms with some agreements and became institutional part of the institution, and were given kitchen space in the student union, and all of those things have allowed it to flourish and become what it is. And I'm sure there are examples from other student-led initiatives across the country. And actually the market that I just mentioned at Guelph is a partnership with some other folks on the campus that are allowing it to grow and become what it is. So I think that's an opportunity. I think, if we think about one other thing that I think about is which is shifting gears in my mind a little bit, but is about the lack of monitoring and transparency to increase and track local procurement on campuses. So, there's a lot of institutional commitments about local sustainable food, but often there's not a lot of monitoring, reporting, transparency on purchasing to evaluate if these commitments are being met. And obviously, as we've talked about here, the definitions of local, sustainable, fair, et cetera, vary greatly. So if there's not really transparency on what gets labeled what, or what defines local, then it can really be hard to know what it is that we're looking at. And so I think, I think that that's just an important thing to name. Obviously, some campuses like UBC are doing a much, leading the way on those kinds of things. But I think there are other campuses where I think that that's pretty poorly lacking. And, as an organization that looks at campuses across the country. I think the last thing that I'll say is that there's a lack of government policy to support local food procurement and address student food insecurity. We have the national food policy, but there's no mention of students or food insecurity in that at all. I think obviously we're seeing the leadership of the BC government and Feed BC, which seems to be really essential to this work in BC, but we don't see that across other provinces in the country. So I think it's important to name. And if we look at other countries, we had some students who were doing some research for us last summer, and they found case studies in Finland and France where there are actual subsidies that go to support affordable food for students on campus. So there's an affordable food option per day for students. And so, I have wondered what if government provided funding to either, institutions, as David raised, or to farmers themselves to subsidize food that would be offered to students at discount, affordable, accessible prices. I think we fund farmers through lots of other ways. So I don't exactly know what line items and things would be impacted by that. And we fund education in a lot of ways through other subsidies to, institutions or government loans for students, et cetera. But if we're not also feeding them, I do wonder about the impact of that overall. Are we making the most of the money that we're putting into the education system? So yeah, that's just one idea, but generally, I think without government policies and support and funding, it's probably unlikely that we're going to see any systemic long-term change on this issue. So anyways, to recap, I think, government support and funding, whether it's provincial or national or both, some sort of monitoring and transparency about what's happening, and actually talking to and just getting involved with students directly, as well as thinking about these larger cultural issues around how we value food and understand how important it is for student well-being and all of our health. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good wrap up as well. But Lindsay, I want to, as we near the end of our time together, I want to give you the chance to dive into this kind of combined question here about how we make this sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. It's such a rich question, and there's been so much rich ideas put on the table already. So I want to go a few different directions with my answer, but I want to start by kind of re-emphasizing Brittany's point about the importance of addressing food insecurity for students, and just like really centering that lived experience of those students who especially those that are disproportionately impacted by food insecurity, and just like really emphasizing the continued importance of advocating that at like all levels and highest levels of government, that we establish that food is a human right, that it's not a commodity, it's a human right, and it's a gift, and with that mindset, advocating for the right sort of poverty reduction tools and income-based supports that are needed to support students that are and all members of our communities that are experiencing food insecurity. I want to reflect also on some of the different threads that we've had about the price point for institutional food, and just sort of reflecting on Kristina's point that like now is really the time to do this, because just looking at certain global situations that are taking place right now that are ultimately going to like really be affecting both the cheapness of global food and the availability and reliability of global food. So, like think about the impact of the Ukraine situation on wheat prices, or global fertilizer shortages, or shipping logistics, or continued intensity of natural disasters, which we're experiencing both like directly here at home right now, but also globally. And so as we think of like moving forward into the next like several years of global instability, climate change, all of those things are going to affect the affordability and reliability of the global supply chain, and building the resilience now into our local food chains is going to be incredibly important. But it also, is likely to mean that, like Kristina, you said, like a company like Goodly can supply soup instead of Campbell's, and that business case, those business fundamentals suddenly become a lot more viable in these situations. So yeah, so I'm thinking about that. I'd really love to add, just looking at my notes, I'd really love to add like an emphasis on possible solutions at the producer level, to start thinking about more alternative business models to small and medium family operated farms on land that is owned privately. So things like bigger scale cooperatively managed farms, community land trusts, like some of the really creative kind of succession planning and leasing arrangements that Young Agrarians is spearheading. All of the support for new entrant farmers, like all of those options for producers. I think that producers that fall into those categories are going to be the ones that are going to be incentivized to engage in the kind of deeper collaboration that that would be needed to participate in meeting institutional demand for local food and even just community demand for local food at a much bigger scale, so that we can sort of break out of this tiny market share that real food has had historically. So like dreaming bigger about what deeper collaboration looks like. I'd really love to see us do that. And I think that there are, both like at the government level, there are policy approaches that can be taken to incentivize those types of alternative farming structures, producing structures. I think it's really important to be putting Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous rights and title to land, like really at the forefront of that discussion. Part of our Food Hub project, the Food Policy Council, has been to redirect a significant portion of our funding and our partnership to Community Futures Central Interior First Nations, who in partnership with us are operating a mobile food processing trailer called the Quiescent Kitchen. There's a really incredible documentary that was filmed on this project last summer that I would recommend anyone check out and watch, and supporting that that kind of work, that Indigenous-led approach to food sovereignty, I think is really essential. Looking to the leadership of the people who managed these lands sustainably for millennia, and kind of really prioritizing those perspectives and that wisdom, I think is really important. And I think that just really building the kinds of trusting relationships that create communities of support for us to start working on shifting our mindsets around food, and addressing in all of the work that we do power imbalances and systems of oppression. It's really hard to sort of find a way of making that work feel tangible. We're solutions oriented right here in, with this question, we really want to be putting tangible solutions. But when you're making systems change, you can't just see, oh, here's a problem, we're going to fix it. Systems are interconnected. They're so complex. And these mindsets are things that are so deeply rooted that affect everything that we do in the system. And so finding ways to shift our thinking, shift our cultural values around food, and build the relationships and the collegial support around us to become people who can do that work, I think is really incredibly important.
Thank you. Wow. I can't thank the four of you enough for this conversation. Like I think Kristina said, super rich, super deep. You probably noticed I was looking down most of the time because I was writing notes. And I think we've got a bit of work ahead of us to summarize what we're learning out of these three learning circles. We plan to write a bit of a report. We hope that some of the learning will also feed into a report that we're writing about the UBCO pilot project, local food pilot project, because that was the intention, that these learning circles would really help us understand the best ways to scale up. And I think that the four of you have provided some really beautiful, specific examples that we can dig deeper into, but you've also provided us this really clear but complex big picture of the systems that we're working within and trying to shift and change. But Lindsay, it's such a good reminder there at the end that when you are working within complexity, really all we can do is make sense of the situation now and take the next best step. And so a lot of what our work will include is taking next best steps this year and then hopefully the following year, while demonstrating the value of this work, understanding the systems that we're trying to change, building champions and building relationships. Like you really have touched on all the elements. Renoir, I wonder if you wouldn't mind kind of unspotlighting us so that we can see everyone who's left. I think we lost some folks. I know Mary was having internet issues, so she got booted off at some point. I'm just going to go back into my gallery view here. But my brain is feeling really rather full. I'm glad we did this in the morning. We can all go away and have a good lunch now and recharge. But before we go, I welcome you to unmute, and just if you'd like to say a few words of maybe kind of what you're walking away with after this morning's discussion, that would be great. Or you can pop that into the chat, because that helps us kind of understand what's surfacing for folks. But yeah, again, thank you for being on the call. This was a deep conversation. So we appreciate you staying for the entire conversation for those who could. And we'll definitely be sharing this out. And we'll probably be sharing a number of project reports on the Land to Table website, but we'll send an email out to all of the folks who registered for these learning circles so that you have access to all the notes and all the recordings to refer back to. But yeah,
I think I just have a comment. Thanks so much for doing this. It was a fantastic conversation and ideas, and I appreciate that there's some people on this call that are definitely more advanced than where we are at Camosun. One thing I realized at an institutional level at Camosun is the Culinary Arts Department is a standalone, and we are the only one that are talking about this. And I would really love to, and I think I will over the next couple of weeks or months, connect with people like David and maybe Jeffrey as well, or Curtis, or anyone who has experience with getting the institution on board, because I work with senior leadership, ancillary services, and a partner or a contractor, Aramark, and none of them are talking about this at a deep level, more than a marketing level. So I think that's kind of what I'm recognizing is, I'm fighting this fight from a culinary arts standpoint, and it's not, I won't be able to win this battle unless I have those partners behind me. So I just appreciate hearing about, how that was done at other institutions, and really getting it to be more of a institutional movement rather than just, a departmental movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great one. Thanks for that. Yeah, Renoir added your thoughts there. Thank you. Yeah.
Just wanted to say thanks very much. It's been super informative this morning, and wow, yeah. Thanks for your time. Certainly from our perspective, I think, in the Okanagan, we sort of plant the seeds for change through the students, right? And that's part of the program design that we're implementing this September. I think a few of you touched on the recent challenges, weather-wise, access-wise, supply chains, and hopefully that's going to start to focus people's attention, on where their food comes from. One of the best quotes from a friend farmer the other day: "Local should be the first choice and not the last resort." And that speaks volumes, right, for putting food on the table, for sure. So yeah, just a big thanks. I'll certainly be reaching out to a few of you, and yeah, David, love to catch up on what's happening in Camosun. And certainly Mr. Speight up at UBCO, and Annelise, I'd love to learn more about the farm and see what we can do together to bring a steer down for the students. Right? So,
sounds good.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your thoughts. Like I said, we'll follow up with an email, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.